when you conflate the two, when you conflate being Jewish with being Israeli, or you substitute a Jew in place of Israeli, that is where you cross lines into anti-Semitism. You can be anti-Israel, you can be an anti-Zionist, and most of the time that is not anti-Semitic. But what Project 2025, what Project Esther has done is weaponize Jewish trauma to advance an authoritarian agenda.
Today on Center Stage, Kevin Rachlin, the Washington director at Nexus Project, a non-profit organization focused on advocacy, education, and policy work around anti-Semitism, particularly how it intersects with Israel-related issues. Rachlin joins Center Stage to explain why he believes the term anti-Semitism is being weaponized as part of the right-wing Project Esther and the larger Project 2025, which has been linked to the Trump administration's crackdown on pro-Palestinian voices. Kevin Rachlin, welcome to Center Stage. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. Happy to be here.
Thank you. So let's start at the very beginning. Let's drill down that one word, or that one term rather, okay. Anti-Semitism. It's something we hear banded around in the media. Mm-hmm. It can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. Just help us put a pin in it. What is the definition, would you say, of anti-Semitism?
Well, that question is actually a lot harder than most people think and say.
Okay.
The generalized definition when we're talking about what is and what is not anti-Semitism is general discrimination or attitude towards hate towards Jews or the Jewish people at large by a variety of different ways. There's different tropes involved, including blood libel, which is like essentially saying that Jews are trying to, replace one other people. That's also links into the Great Replacement theory, to even going even further into the puppet master theories and the Rothberg theories that we control everything. And those are all kind of the basics around what is and what is not anti-Semitic. But then there are also currently right now 3 separate definitions that are out there kind of circulating around that are aiming to provide more context and information about what is and what is not anti-Semitic.
And it's not necessarily against the actions of the Israeli government.
Correct.
It's.
I was very specific when I noticed. I didn't even say that.
Yeah.
Yes.
But that's one of the things that we've heard a lot about is it against Jewish people, or is it against what the Israeli government's doing? And is there a line?
There's absolutely a line, I would say, between what the Israeli government is doing versus what Israel is doing versus the larger Jewish population in the world. And I think that when you conflate the two, when you conflate being Jewish with being Israeli, or you substitute a Jew in place of Israeli, that is where you cross lines into anti-Semitism. But what I normally say to people is, you can be anti-Israel, you can be an anti-Zionist, and most of the time that is not anti-Semitic. But some of the time it actually is anti-Semitic. And being able to identify when certain language and the impact of your language impacts Jews in a specific way is actually really important for people. And I think in this day and age, so many individuals kind of paint with a broad brush, which is why we're seeing so many new accusations of anti-Semitism out there right now, specifically towards college campuses, around protests around Palestinian freedoms, pro-Palestinian rights, things like that, where you're starting to blur the line between being pro-Israel, anti-Israel, pro-Palestinian, anti-Palestinian, and all of these are starting to get muddled into the anti-Semitism debate right now.
All right, so we've got that. We'll park that to one side for just a second, and we'll come back to it in a minute. Let's look at the projects.
Yes.
Okay, so Project 2025 was a term we heard so much last year throughout the election campaign. It is essentially a policy, a document, a theory that was put together by a number of conservative organizations. The main
Mainly
one,
the
Heritage Foundation, which is a big conservative think tank in Washington, D.C. And it outlined what a future or a second Trump presidency could look like. And I went to so many events where Kamala Harris said, Project 2025, this is a warning, this is going to happen.
It was real.
I went to so many Trump events where he said, nothing to do with me, know nothing about it, it's nothing to do with me. Some on the left are now saying it is coming to life. First of all, is that something you would agree with?
Yes.
And secondly, all right, Project Esther, which is the other project. What is that?
Yeah.
How does it all tie together?
So I actually think it's so to answer the first question, I 100% think it is coming to fruition when you go back and read through all of Project 2025, which I have unfortunately done, including I made sure to read the entire section on the Department of Education, because that was really important as we're talking about anti-Semitism on college campuses. What they have done, what they have outlined in Project 25, this administration has begun to do and is continuing to do. Look at what has happened to USAID, the U.S. Agency for International Development. Look at what happened to the Development Finance Corporation. Look what's happened to the Department of Education, U.S. Institute for Peace. These were all identified in Project 25 as things to be either shut down, rolled back, or just quote unquote non-American. and not for what this administration has been doing. What was scary about 2025 was how detailed it was. And it was very clear that the writers, including the current director of the Office of Management and Budget in the administration right now, knew what they were going to do right when they came into office, that there was a plan and that they were going to execute it, that it wasn't going to be like it was in the first term, which was kind of, the first year was whatever, just kind of crazy. Let's talk about Esther though, because this is something that didn't really come out until October 24. And to your point, everyone was talking about 2025. Very few people, myself, others in my space, were talking about Project Esther. It is an addendum, is for lack of a better term, to 2025. And by that I mean Project 2025 is the blueprint on how to transition the American system of government into an autocracy. And that's, I think, the first thing. It's to systematically change how we as a nation are going to operate, what it's going to mean, and things like that. Project Esther is the means to do it. And what it is, what they claim it is, I should say, and I want to be very clear what they claim versus what it is they claim it is a national strategy to combat anti-Semitism throughout the country, that they believe it is a national priority to combat anti-Semitism. And to that, I actually applaud. I agree. Yeah. It is a national priority. That's why myself, Nexus, every other major legacy Jewish organization, a new Jewish organization, pretty much supported the Biden national strategy to combat anti-Semitism, which came out in 2023. And so it was very odd to see this other one come out that had no Jewish input, was written mostly by Christian Zionists, and coming from a major conservative think tank. So why was this happening? And when you start to read the document, you understand. One, they label everything that is not essentially conservative as the Hamas support network. And then they go through systematically on how to attack those organizations to essentially eradicate, quote unquote, anti-Semitism from the United States government. Just to give you a couple of examples of what Project Esther has talked about and things to do. They claim that our colleges and universities are rife with anti-Semitism, that they're filled with foreign money, and that our universities should be defunded until that is properly addressed. I can rightfully say how many universities at this point have had their funding cut. Had Harvard, Columbia, UCLA system, the UC system in California have all been threatened or have had funding cut for quote unquote anti-Semitism. But what's stark about it is that what they're cutting isn't money to the Middle East programs. It's for cancer research. It's for robotics. It's for artificial intelligence. And to which I say, that is not, if the issue is what's being taught in the Middle East studies and what is being taught there, what does canceling cancer research do to protect me as a Jew? And the answer is it's not. The ideology behind this is to really hobble and hinder public universities and higher education at large as a means to create this new environment that they want America to become. And that's just one example out of many that Esther talks about. But what Project 2025, what Project Esther has done is weaponize Jewish trauma to advance an authoritarian agenda.
So how does all this link in with the issue of freedom of speech? Because there is a thing here in the United States called the First Amendment,
Love it.
Which, you can't incite violence, but you can pretty much say what you want. And that may include what some would term hate speech, no matter how unpalatable your views may be seen by others, no matter how disgusting some people may say, you can say what you want.
Absolutely.
How does this how do you square the circle here? Yeah.
How do you square the circle? It's actually very interesting because you're right. In this country and very rarely around the world, we are one of the few places that has enshrined that freedom of speech. But I would say is that in this country, you are allowed to say and think despicable things. And that's it. I can sit next to somebody and say, I absolutely hate what you're espousing. I think it's vile. I think it's evil. However, you have every right to say and think that. It's when that starts to translate into action that things become issues. So when speech becomes intimidation, when speech becomes discrimination, when speech turns into violence, that is when the First Amendment pulls back, and that's when you get civil rights laws and actual law to come into place. When somebody is threatened or discriminated against by virtue of who they are, that is when it's time to start, that's the real intervention that starts to happen. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't make an effort to change those people's hearts and minds now. And I think what a lot of people are, and I think particularly in my community, what we've started to see post 10/7 is this thrust to kind of hit everybody over the head of what this is without really taking the time to educate, without sitting down with people and actually talking to them at face value and saying, let's talk about what you just said and how you said it.
So how are we seeing at the moment Project Esther in real time? You know, I mean, we've seen situations like
The universities is one.
or Khalil,
Yeah.
you know, for
Clear,
example.
and actually, that was the second one I was going to bring up.
Okay.
There's a specific definition. This administration, both the previous time Trump was in office and now, has relied on the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism, which has essentially, to boil it down, is essentially anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, full stop. It's the best way to describe it. What they have done actually is utilize this definition in terms of scrubbing social media profiles to identify potential visa holders or non-visa holders or people who are applying for visas through their social media accounts, no less, and denying them visas or deporting them for quote unquote anti-Semitism, anti-Western values, and things like that. That is not what this tool is for. And that is, I mean, even though I disagree with it being used in that way, and with a lot of the definitions I have disagreements about, but that doesn't make Jews safe. Deporting kids, deporting people who are looking to get an education does not make us safe, does not make our country safe, doesn't make, all it does is breed resentment and anger, and just foment something that's already there. We need to be able to bring people in. We need to have them to be able to have a conversation. We need to be able to talk to people.
And the tool to do that is, I gather, and you can flesh this out for me more, but anti-Semitism is now being deemed a version of terrorism, and that gives more latitude.
I think that's a broad statement, but yes, I think it's being used as the fig leaf to advance what this administration is trying to do. So if you take immigration, anti-Semitism was at the front of immigration. When you take what happened in higher education with the schools, right at the front of that. When you look at taxes and things that we're talking about, there's a lot of talk around what is and what is not anti-Semitism. There's a reason why the Republicans have held, I want to say, last year, 10 anti-Semitism hearings on various committees. I know because I testified in 2 of them, and none of them came out with tangible recommendations on what to actually do to combat anti-Semitism. The only thing they could come up with is, let's put a definition of anti-Semitism on the books, and that is the silver bullet that everyone can agree on. To which I say, no, that's a placebo. If you actually want to combat anti-Semitism, you need to harden targets. You need to invest in anti-Semitism education and Holocaust education. You need to invest in coalition building between minority groups. You know, part of what this is also what Esther is trying to do is divide Jews from their natural allies in the United States. And like separating Jews from that, you're putting more distance and actually making us less safe. We are more safe when we are in partnership and coalition, fighting for our democracy together with our allies.
But it's also, I mean, it's a vote winner, isn't it? I mean, you think about where we are now. We've got the midterms in 2026. So campaigning's already...
Presidential campaign's already started.
Well, yeah, and perhaps J.D. Vance may be running in 2028. For those who are not like following the intricacies, to just say we are going to combat anti-Semitism, you know, as a headline,
it's a good checkbox.
Yeah, but that's going to get people behind you, isn't it?
And I think this is one of the things that they've latched onto, that obviously we're against anti-Semitism. Everyone's against anti-Semitism. You don't want to be labeled an anti-Semite.
Well, they will say the Democrats are not.
Well, then that's where I'm getting.
Right.
And they will say that they are the only ones fighting anti-Semitism the right way. That, why, if we do this, obviously the Jews here will vote for us. And there's so many reasons why that's incorrect, not to mention the fact that the Jewish population in this country has not voted for a Republican president ever. The last election, it was 70-30. The previous election before that, it was 70-30. The previous election before that, it was 70-30. We as Jews did not vote for this administration. We do not support, the vast majority of us do not support what this administration is doing in our names to combat anti-Semitism. It doesn't help us. And in fact, it makes us less safe.
generally, what do Americans think about this? It's one thing talking to people in Los Angeles or in New York or in DC, where you will have those bubbles. But let's take John Doe walking down the street in Iowa or Kansas City or Nebraska, somewhere in Nebraska. How's it affecting his life, and why would he even care about this?
So that's a really good question. I'm from Ohio, so when you're talking about these people, I know exactly what you're talking about, and I know who they are. And a lot of the times, it doesn't matter to them. They like kitchen table issues. They want to know how much the milk is going to cost the next day. They want to know, for Iowa, how much is soy going to be worth in the next year? Who's going to protect my interests, and how am I going to put food on my table for my family? Now, that's not to say they don't care. They absolutely care, but it's at a very superficial level. The real question is what does that mean? And for so many people in, the center of the country where I'm from, the breadbasket, the Midwest, the Plain States, and even, the smaller areas, the Northwest, South, and the South, they don't know the intricacies of this. So they're relying on news. They're relying on what they're seeing in each of their news sources. And one of the unfortunate things that's happened, which I'm sure you can sympathize with, is that in this country, we've become so focused in our own little bubble that they only get one specific source versus others. And so hearing another narrative is very difficult for people. And so when they look at the anti-Semitism factor, they see a lot of it happening. Oh, it must be the college campuses. This was the story, that student protests were running rampant and that anti-Semitism was rampant on campuses. And I think that is where a lot of the average American still thinks it is right now. They haven't connected that some of what is happening on the immigration level, at the political level, at their own state level, what this means, how this could potentially impact their own freedom of speech as well.
So Project Esther looks at expanding surveillance around protests. How does that look? What are we talking about? Are we talking about tapping phones? Are we talking about CCTV?
So they've already started this. The last executive order that Trump issued, which I think was in March of this past year on anti-Semitism, specifically asked the universities to begin monitoring social media profiles of their students. It was to basically turn the university system into a department of ICE, and to allow them to find out who is being anti-Israel, anti-Semitic, and that was the intent. They have already started doing that, and what's more eerie about it is that in many cases for these deportations, when they're targeting people, they're not relying on their own form of surveillance. There are groups out there that are specifically looking for people consistently to find them, to dox them, to make sure that the administration has all the information they need about them so that when the time comes, they can be deported or pushed away, or that they can come after people. Groups like, sometimes like stopantisemitism.org or the Canary Mission, that these organizations have lists and lists, or Batar, which is basically a Twitter account, lists of individuals, both Jews, non-Jews, academics, protesters, activists, politicians, advocates like myself, people like myself, all on these lists of people who are quote unquote anti-Western, anti-Israel, anti-Semitic, and they have files on them. And this is some of the things that the administration is using to find people and to execute on them, and to deport them. And I think it's only going to get worse. That it's very much a lobster in a pot scenario. They're slowly turning up the heat, and it's that old poem that we used to talk about. That first they came for such and such, and then they came for such and such, and that I didn't speak up. And then when they finally came for me, there was no one left to speak for me. It's from the Holocaust. It's eerily similar that we're seeing something happen like that here. That first it was the immigrants, and then it was the visa holders. And then it's, now they're starting to talk about people who are citizens or have already become citizens. And then they're starting to move even further to, are you born here? And like each time it gets a little bit harsher. And it's all being done under this guise of protecting Americans, protecting Jews. And it just does not keep us safe.
I'm curious to know what the reaction to all of this has been like within Israel. What can you tell us about that?
The prime minister has made it very clear that being anti-Israel, being an anti-Zionist is anti-Semitism. And, that is their thing when people criticize the war and other items. There's a call for anti-Semitism. Our administration has mirrored those talking points, and so they're very happy with it. But that's not to say that there isn't a massive population in Israel who are constantly on the streets protesting against Bibi Netanyahu and Gideon Sa'ar and Smotrich and everyone else. That what they are doing is not in the best interest of the Israeli people. It's not in the best interest of the government, of the safety and security of Israel. Yet they're still using anti-Semitism as a shield to block everything else. There's a reason why, the Commission of Inquiry, the ICC, the UN, these are, quote unquote, anti-Semitic organizations. I'm not going to excuse any of them for what they've, some of the things they've done, some of the hypocrisy, the double standards that they've done. But to say that they are full blank, anti-Semitic organizations because they've opted to look at the war in Gaza in a critical light, I think that is grossly incorrect.
There have been occasions over the last few months where Trump used expletives talking about Netanyahu. So there is now some daylight. Is that daylight, do you think, going to expand? Do you think they will remain aligned? And how will this affect what those behind Project Esther, how they conduct themselves?
Do I think that there's daylight right now? Absolutely. I think there is daylight between the two leaders. But I think, what does that translate into in terms of, will the U.S. change its policy vis-a-vis the war in Gaza, vis-a-vis arming Israel? No. I think this administration is lockstep behind Israel at this point. And nothing that has been said or done really changes my mind about that. I think even with the recent reports that Trump said in a closed-door meeting that there will be a Palestinian state and that Israel will not annex the West Bank, I think that's notable that leaked. But that doesn't stop the fact that Israel announced that they are going to be settling in E1, that they're going to be doing this, that Benny Gantz even has proposed settling in the Jordan Valley, and he's not even in the government. And so this idea that this president could potentially do something, he has that ability. If he really wanted to do that, if he wanted to be the peace builder that he says that he is, he could do it. There's a way to do it. The question is, does he have the political will to do it? And more importantly, is there an incentive for him? And I think the key thing to remember is that our president is driven a lot by incentive towards himself. So that's what I would say on that. As this relates to Project Esther, I think that those who push forward Project Esther, Victoria, those at the Heritage Foundation and others, and the others in the administration will continue to have something to kind of prop up to continue that slow advance. And actually, I shouldn't say it's slow. It's getting kind of quick advance towards, eroding our democracy and kind of creating that autocracy that they so want.
Kevin Rachlin, thank you very much for joining us here on Center Stage.
Thank you so much for having me.